Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to you all in Malaysia, and hello to everyone who have joined this session, webinar session on design and development of massive open online courses series that we have been doing since mid of April. Today, with me, I have a special guest, Professor Allison Littlejohn from the UK. Professor Littlejohn, those of you who are not aware of her credentials, I would take the liberty to share a few words. Professor Littlejohn is a learning scientist who specializes particularly in professional learning through technology. Currently, she is director of the Knowledge Lab at University College London. She has a large number of publications, over 260 peer-reviewed publications with over 40 in H-Index. And I am a huge fan of her work, and I follow her work quite religiously. We are really lucky to have Professor Allison Littlejohn with us today to speak about quality assurance of massive open online courses. She has written extensively on this area of work, including contributing to CALL's quality assurance guideline on massive open online courses. She actually led the work and did the research work for that publication that CALL brought out. So we have with us somebody who has worked on MOOCs and other technology frontiers and have done it and seen it and contributed extensively on this field of work. And we are thankful to you, Professor Allison, for joining us today, and look forward to your presentation.
There we go. Can you see?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's a real honor to be here today. And I understand many of you are in the medical and health areas, which is an area that I've been working with colleagues in different universities. And so I'm really interested in hearing what your thoughts are about MOOCs and learning. But of course, I want to start by situating this in the moment in time that we are at just now. So we're united globally in terms of fighting a pandemic. And that's very relevant to MOOCs because right now universities around the world are closed or are having to change the way that we teach. And education will likely change forever, as will many of the things that we do day to day. And of course, there are many countries that we're learning from. We're learning from each other around the world. And in China, the universities already have changed the way that they've been teaching during the pandemic there. A lot of students were either having to stay on campus and learn using technologies. And then once they allowed more movement, then they have social distancing embedded into their education system. And here in the UK, we're still in the lockdown. All university campuses are closed and all students are learning via technology, some of them by MOOCs and some of them by video lectures. In the Knowledge Lab, some of my colleagues, Diana Laurillard, Eileen Kennedy and others, are working with FutureLearn, which is, as you probably know, a MOOC platform to run massive open online courses to enable teachers in higher education and in school education around the world to learn how to transform their teaching. Because, as you know, running a MOOC is not simply taking the kind of teaching that you do face-to-face on campus and putting it online. It involves a much more fundamental rethink about how people can actually learn online. So this MOOC has been running for the past few weeks, transforming education in challenging environments, and we can't have a more challenging time globally than we have right now. And they've had over 20,000 teachers who formed their own community. And those teachers are interacting together. They're learning from experts. They're learning from each other. And they're actually practicing how they're going to change their teaching. And of course, we've seen a massive uptake in the number of people who are learning in MOOCs. Here's what happened in Coursera. They had a 607% increase in the number of people who were studying in MOOCs, in Coursera MOOCs, between March 17th and April 16th this year compared with last year. So we're seeing this massive increase in uptake. But what's going to happen once we are post-COVID-19 and as the pandemic continues? How is education likely to go forward? Well, 2 days ago in the UK, Cambridge University was the first to announce that all lectures in the next year will be online. Of course, Cambridge and Oxford have a very different teaching model from most other universities. They have a tutorial-based model where the students learn in colleges, and much of the teaching is with their personal tutor. So to have lectures that are recorded is a difference for them, but the main teaching will still happen face-to-face in very small and socially distanced groups. So perhaps in the UK at least, some of the biggest changes will be at universities which are newer. So University of Bolton have also announced how they're going to be teaching post-pandemic. And again, much of their teaching is switching to online, even though the students will have opportunity to go to campus for 12 hours per week. The students will be socially distanced. The large lecture spaces will be used as more tutorial spaces where the students can interact with each other and with their tutor. And much of the broadcast teaching will be online. They'll be using a combination of different approaches to teaching online. But of course, with all of this comes opportunities, but there are also a number of risks. This story was in The Guardian this week. It's really worthwhile reading. It was talking about some of the advantages that we have with online learning and with MOOCs, but also some of the dangers and uncertainties that there are. So there are a lot of new platforms that are being embedded into education just now, where they're measuring various different parameters and factors. Every keystroke of a student can be measured. And with that comes opportunity to track student learning and to guide students, but there are also some dangers in terms of datafication and embedded practices, which really needs some critique. And of course, with all this uncertainty, the sector already had uncertainty before there was a pandemic. So this is a study from 2 years ago of vice-chancellors in the UK. These are, vice-chancellors are the senior figures in universities. And 63% of them felt less optimistic about the future of university and the financial prospects. They didn't feel confident about strategy, and that has only become even more marked as the pandemic has gone forward. Of course, they're looking to online learning as a solution, and now with social distancing required, it's almost the only solution that we have. And some of the benefits of using the online learning and MOOCs during the pandemic is that we can have less social contact of students and of teachers and students. There's the opportunity to have an improved experience, that learning can be personalized through tracking and so on. And of course, universities that are struggling to recruit students for next year can have improved incomes. But of course, there are risks as well. A lot of these risks are around quality. We've seen when universities closed down, a lot of the face-to-face teaching was put online, rather than rethinking the design and thinking about the affordances of the internet. Often the students are left to learn on their own online, which is very different from face-to-face. Although students may be sitting in a lecture and listening, there's a lot of social interaction. The lecture is actually a very social experience. And of course, many teachers are not prepared and feel quite anxious and nervous about teaching online. With the introduction of platforms, there's an unprecedented rate of change. As I said earlier on, increased datafication as data is gathered, and that can affect human rights. It can also build in some of the prejudices that we have in every day into the systems that we have. We have this creeping surveillance where everything that people do is watched. And there's a new relationship between students and teachers, which is mediated by technology. And of course, one of the key things is the expectation of students. We've been doing surveys here in terms of our international students and how they expect to learn at University College London if they come here for the next academic year. And they want to learn face-to-face. They don't really want to come to campus to learn online, nor do they really want to sign up for an online experience. So we have to really think about, are there ways that we can not only offer online teaching, but maybe blended learning as well, in a way where we can safely allow people to learn, but also have some kind of social interaction. So I mentioned that the pivot online is the moment when universities decided that they were going to do their teaching online. And here in the UK, at least, many of the universities did this over a weekend. So on the Thursday or the Friday, the teaching was face-to-face in lectures, and by the Monday, it had to be completely online. And that was with students who were asked to go back to their country of residence. So many of those students had to go to countries around the world. About half of the students at UCL are in other countries. And many of our students had to go into isolation. So for example, students who went back to China were in 28 days of isolation, and 14 of those days were in a residency or a hotel where the Wi-Fi maybe wasn't as good as we'd hoped. But what we really want to think about is, how do we move from this, not just simply putting face-to-face online? You can see the image at the top. This is often, broadcast lectures and so on is often the way that we go online. But how can we move from that to something which is much more immersive and interactive and using the internet as it should be used? So a few years ago, myself and my colleague Nina Hood were funded by the Commonwealth of Learning to carry out a study in terms of MOOC quality, to think about quality and design and how we go towards better quality MOOCs. And we were very fortunate to have the guidance of Sanjay Mishra, and I want to thank him for that. And what we did during this study was we categorized various dimensions of quality using John Biggs framework, which is quite a well-known framework. This framework looks at 3 different aspects of learning, which is termed Presage, the process and product. Now, the Presage is what people do before learning. So how do you prepare for the learning? The process is what you do during the learning, and the product is what comes after the learning. So we were very interested to know what happens in all 3 of these stages. And I want you to think about those 3 stages I'm going to ask you to discuss in a moment. And we did a search of the literature to find out what was being written about MOOCs, particularly in those 3 stages. Then we had a Delphi study with 3 rounds with 17 experts from 7 countries. And in fact, we held an event which was in KL to validate some of the findings that we had. And what the results showed was that the quality measures of the MOOC really depend on the purpose of the MOOC. So a MOOC that you would design for undergraduate learning in business administration, for example, would be very different from a MOOC which is for midwives or for doctors who are in clinical care. But at the end of the study, we produced these two documents which are available to you. So one, Quality MOOC Surveying the Terrain, is really the literature review that we did. So this gives you some of the indicators, some of the things that people are talking about when they think about the before, during, and after learning. And then also there's the guidelines for quality assurance that I think we're going to discuss more about later. But before we go any further, I want to stop just for a couple of minutes and ask you to think about what is it that you think that you should consider if you're designing a MOOC. What is it you should think about in terms of before learning? So before people start learning, what's the first thing that we start off with the design? During the learning, what is important? And after the learning? And what I'd like you to do is to put into the chat. I'm going to ask Sanjay if he would read out to me some of the comments. I can't actually see them here.
Yes, I will do that. Please go ahead and type on the chat. Colleagues, yes. Some of the comments are on preparedness, thinking about reachability, using both synchronous and asynchronous mode of teaching. Any from the Presage or the process or from the product, you can think about this in different ways. And Trexie has just said that process fun for participants and how to make it, fun oriented.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Charles has told the Presage market demand for relevant course. Dr. Bamini has talked about the process and student feedback is an issue. Dr. Nuthara talks about student accessibility and flow of learning. So these are some of the comments.
Okay, that's great. So those are very insightful points to make. What I'd like to do is to go through what we found. And in terms of the Presage before the learning, we tended to find that people were focusing on two things. One was the platform. So which platform provider was going to host the MOOC. So places like Coursera, FutureLearn, edX, and so on. And also the provider of the MOOC, so which university, the prestige factor associated with that. And actually, we don't believe that those are the best factors to think about when we scoped through and we looked at the quality of various MOOCs. It wasn't always because of the platform providers or the universities. It was more about starting with the learners themselves. So taking into consideration who are the learners. In MOOCs, we have a real diversity of learners, much more diverse than normal, traditional university classrooms. So who are they and what are their needs? And then in terms of during the learning, we found that people tended to focus very much on the content resources that were there. Were they open? Were they good quality? And while that is important, we didn't find what we hoped to what we expect to find, which was, are students able to learn? What are the abilities of the students to learn in these very new environments, which are quite different from face-to-face teaching? So here are some papers and some studies that I did with my colleagues Helen Beetham and Lou McGill about 10 years ago, which really said that universities have to think about enabling students to be able to learn very effectively in digital and blended environments. But we found very little consideration of that. And in terms of the product, much of the focus was on completion rates, so do students complete? And we felt that completion rate is not a good measure of whether a MOOC has been successful, because it depends on the purpose of the MOOC. And we found that rather than focusing on the outcome for the learner and whether the learner had actually been able to make a change and a transformation, that was kind of getting lost in some of the measures. So in summary, here are the sections which are in this Quality in MOOCs paper if you want to read it. And we found all of these different areas were covered in the literature, but these are the ones that we felt were the most significant and the most important if you want to design a high quality MOOC. So what I'm going to do now is to give examples that demonstrate good quality in each of these areas, the before, during, and after learning. And in terms of before learning, I'm going to quickly show you 3 different MOOCs where there's been real consideration about who the learners are. And in fact, each of these MOOCs have used a design process called co-design. Now, co-design is being used quite extensively now. It's a way of bringing together not just the teachers and representative students, but technologists and a whole range of different stakeholders to work together in a very intensive way to design the MOOC before it's then produced and facilitated. And actually, co-design process is one that's used very extensively by the Open University in the UK. So the first example I'm going to give is being run by my colleagues in the Knowledge Lab, Diana Laurillard and Eileen Kennedy. And this is part of a project which has been funded called the Relief Centre. It's based in Lebanon, and it's for people who are in the country as refugees. These are displaced people, and they have very limited opportunity for education. And it's possible that whole generations of children can actually miss out on education. So this MOOC is meant for a whole diverse range of different types of displaced people. And Diana and Eileen have spent some time co-designing this MOOC with the people who are actually learning and for them. And they've also made sure that it's able to be contextualized so that if you're in a refugee camp, you can still learn from this MOOC with whatever technology that you have. So from the very beginning, the learners are the focus of the design in this MOOC. And the MOOC itself focuses on the kinds of things that people need to learn, not just in terms of an education syllabus, but some of the key skills that they need to learn in their context. Now, a second example is by Annette Dalsgaard from Denmark. And she is a midwife academic, and she's also one of my PhD students. And for her PhD, she designed a MOOC with some colleagues in Australia and with some midwives around the world. Now, she doesn't use any platform at all. She doesn't use FutureLearn or Coursera. She simply uses tools that are available to her, so websites, blogs, and other ways of interacting. And they built this MOOC so that these midwives around the world could share ideas about practice. So this MOOC could be understood as a community of midwives, and they're sharing their practice and supporting and learning from each other. Because again, taking the needs of the midwives into consideration and allowing them to see how the practice is done in other countries, and therefore think about why they do things in their country in a specific way, has been a really insightful learning experience for these midwives. The third one I want to show is by a company called Kieran, which is based in Germany. So this is an NGO, a non-governmental organization working with refugees in Germany. And they've designed MOOCs specifically for these refugees to help them get back into education. Once people complete a certain number of MOOCs, then they're guaranteed a university place in Germany. So again, this has been designed, the whole process designed around the needs of the learners and what it is they want to do. So people are very focused and very motivated to participate in these MOOCs. So these are 3 examples where the MOOCs have been co-designed with the learners around the needs of the learner. So the teachers have allowed the learners to say, this is what I really need. This is my motivation, my goal, and where I want to be. So now I want to go on to the second part, the process during the learning. And one key factor here is that people learn very differently depending on what their motivations are and the design of the MOOC. A number of years ago, myself and a number of colleagues compared how people learn in 2 MOOCs that were part of the edX platform. One was run by Harvard. It was one of the first edX MOOCs. It's called the Introduction to Clinical Trials. And the second one was run by the University of Washington, Introduction to Data Science. And we were quite amazed at the differences in terms of how people learn in these MOOCs. We used a theory called self-regulated learning by Barry Zimmerman. And basically, self-regulation looks at key factors that influence how people learn. So things like their confidence, their ability to decide on their own goals, not just the goals of the course, their interest. So this comes into the comment earlier about is the learning fun? Am I interested in it? Their ability to change the way they learn. If they weren't learning initially in one way, could they switch to another learning strategy? The way that they would seek help from other people. Their satisfaction with how they learned and how they viewed themselves as a learner. And finally, learning challenge. So the resilience, if you're not learning, if you're not doing well, can you come through that and just persist and be resilient? So these were the factors that we were measuring using a survey that we sent out to the learners in these MOOCs. And we had a high number of responses from them, so quite a lot of data. We followed that up with interviews. And I'm going to show you some of the things that people told us about how they learned. The first thing we did was we measured people's self-regulation. And now self-regulation is not set. We're all sometimes highly self-regulated and at other times less self-regulated. So if I take an example for myself, I think when I'm in work, I'm highly self-regulated because I'm learning every day. I'm very keen and eager to learn. But if I, for example, go to the gym, I want to be told what to do. So I'm less self-regulated there. I'm more regulated by the teacher. So when we measured the self-regulation in the University of Washington MOOC, which had 40,000 learners, and you can see the number of responses that we had there, 788 responses from people in 79 countries. What we found was that people who told us that they were low self-regulators, they tended to be motivated to complete the class certificate. So these are the kinds of things that they told us. I wanted to do whatever I needed to do to get the certificate, and I'm prioritizing getting certificates. But we found that people who told us that they were highly self-regulated focused on their work. Now remember, these are computer scientists, so they are people who are generally doing computer science at work, and some of these people want to learn how to code in a better way. So these are the things that the high self-regulators said to us. I wanted to see about the impact my work could have. I wanted to learn about coding, and completion was less important to me. Now that's very important if we're measuring MOOCs by completion rates. You can see that these people are very motivated to learn, and they're learning a lot, but they might not be completing. So the people who were highly self-regulated linked what they were doing with their work and with their goals at work. And they were very strategic about what they did. They didn't worry if they went through every part of the MOOC. They just simply went to where they felt they could learn. Whereas the people who were low self-regulators, they tried to watch every part of the video, go through every part of the MOOC, and they became very anxious about their learning. Now I want to compare that with another MOOC, which is the Harvard Medical School, which was run on the edX platform. We had 350 responses from people in this MOOC, and we interviewed 30 of them. Now, although this is also a MOOC which was run for people who are professionals, we found that most people were motivated to get the certificate because they wanted a Harvard Medical School certificate of completion. So we found that the people who told us they were highly self-regulated or less self-regulated both had a very similar motivation, which was to get that certificate. We found, like the previous MOOC on computer science, that people who had low self-regulation tended to follow the structure of the MOOC. So that they were regulated by the teacher, they went through the MOOC as they were instructed to do so, they went through every question, they reviewed all the texts and the videos. But what we found was that the people who told us they were highly self-regulated learned in a different way, like the previous MOOC. So they didn't always go through all the materials, but what they did was they figured out what they needed to do to get the certificate. So the way that people learn really depends on what their motivation is. And in the introduction to data science, we found that people were generally very motivated in different ways. So the high self-regulators wanted to learn how to code better for their work, whereas the low self-regulators wanted to complete the certificate. Whereas in the clinical trials, both high and low self-regulators had the same motivation, but the way they went about achieving what they were motivated to do was quite different. Now, we've done a number of studies over a range of different MOOCs, and we have found that there are a number of factors that really influence how people learn in MOOCs. So one is their confidence. Another is their interest. So if you can ensure that people are very interested in what it is they're learning, so if you know what's the reason that they're taking this MOOC, that is very likely to improve their learning. Their ability to switch from one learning strategy to another. So if they try to learn, it doesn't work for them, and then they can switch to another way of learning, that will also improve their efficiency and effectiveness of learning and the outcomes. And of course, how they compare how they're performing in the MOOC and how satisfied they feel. So the most important thing is not that they do everything in the MOOC, but that they're actually learning. And that's another key factor. So these are various factors that we really need to think if we want to produce and design and facilitate high quality MOOCs. So now I'm going to move on to the final product after learning. And I said before that one of the key measures of MOOCs tends to be the completion rates. Whereas in our study, what we found was that rather than focusing on a measure of a completion rate, there are other measures that we should maybe think about in the MOOC. And I want to talk here about a study that I'm doing with the Open University UK and with the Fleming Fund, which is funded by the UK Government Department of Health and Social Care, which is looking at antimicrobial resistance. This is part of a much bigger project where we're trying to work with people around the world to help them to build into their health systems antimicrobial resistance surveillance, which will reduce the ability of bacteria to become resistant to antibiotics. So this has been a 3-year study so far, where we're working with people in countries around the world, thinking about what is their health context, how can we design, deliver and evaluate learning events, including MOOCs, that can help them improve the context. And then how can we develop a longer term approach where learning is at the center of changing these health systems. So in the first year of the project, this is what we did. We visited 3 different countries, which was Ghana, Tanzania, and Bhutan. We gathered from them, we worked with key stakeholders to gather information to help co-design learning events. These were a MOOC and a MOOC plus face-to-face sessions. And then we ran those in the countries to see how that could build capacity in terms of antimicrobial resistance and surveillance. And so this is just some information about the kinds of people that we were working with. And these are the people who are learning in these MOOCs. So lab professionals, including those who are managing the labs, clinical services people, policy makers, and AMR, antimicrobial resistance experts as well. So we interviewed all these people to try to understand their needs before we designed the learning events. We also wanted to understand what were the knowledge and skills gaps. So what did they think people need to learn about in order to improve the surveillance system? And these are the skills gaps. Though the ones in bold are the ones that most people mention. So things like good laboratory practice, foundations in microbiology, understanding that antimicrobial resistance is changing all the time. But also other areas which are probably less intuitive, like communication, collaboration, and advocacy. So learning new ways to work together was also a very important thing to learn. And we produced a massive open online course, which we ran through the Open Learn platform, which is part of the UK Open University. Now, this massive open online course had badges, so it's technically a BOC, a badged open course. And it was designed with the professionals, and it was run so that professionals could learn this course from their work. Not everyone had a computer at home. Therefore, it was important that we tried to design the course in a way so that people could have access to a computer at work and have time at work as well to learn on the course. We also discovered that even if people learn the knowledge and skills that they need to do their job better, in this case, antimicrobial surveillance, unless people actually change their workplace at the same time, the learning isn't going to have the impact that it needs. And this is actually quite an important point, because it illustrates that it can be sometimes important to have a face-to-face element in events as well. So in the second MOOC that we ran, we actually also had a face-to-face meetup in various different workplaces where people didn't just learn about antimicrobial surveillance and learn about new techniques, but they then thought about their own workplace and could they apply these techniques. So one example we had was in some countries, the procurement process was such that when people bought the medium for the plate so they could test for antimicrobial resistance, it wasn't good enough quality. So it didn't matter how well they learned the knowledge and skills, they couldn't apply those knowledge and skills without having the right kind of equipment. So they changed that within the workplace to be able to make sure that they were creating good quality data. So these were the two ways that we delivered the MOOCs in the pilot study. So the first on data use and interpretation was where we actually ran online MOOCs, and then we had meetup events in the local workplaces where people could then think about how they would apply this knowledge to their work and whether or not they needed to change or restructure something in their work. And then the second one was a more traditional badged open course, which was available widely globally. So that's all I want to say about the Presage process and product. And here are some of the key messages. In terms of Presage, it's really important to focus on the learners and the learners' needs and what motivates them to learn, what's the purpose of learning. And then during learning, it's important to think about whether people are able to learn or not to enable this equity of participation. Can everybody actually learn in a MOOC? And if they're not able to learn, can they interact with others who can maybe help them to learn? And then after the learning, rather than thinking about measures in terms of completion rates, it's important to have a whole range of different indicators. So I'd be very interested to hear some of your thoughts, and I'm going to hand back to Professor Mishra.
So thank you each one of from around the world and particularly University of Malaysia Sabah. Thanks to Professor Fong for joining in, and especially thanks to Professor Allison. Thank you very much for your time you have spent with us, particularly with our colleagues who are from University of Malaysia Sabah, who are very interested. And some of the things that you have touched upon, as I said in the beginning, many of the participants from UMS are from the School of Health Sciences, and I'm sure they must have enjoyed some of the examples that you shared today with them. So thank you once again for your time.